infinite complacence, people went to and fro over the earth about their little affairs, serene in the assurance of their dominion over this small, spinning fragment of solar driftwood, which by chance or design man has inherited out of the dark mystery of time and space.
What if monsters and entities exist? What if all the encounters reported on podcasts like Into the Fray are true? What happens when they creep into our world from other dimensions? Who would stop them? Who could? Project Threshold. This fall 2023, Project Threshold, created by Craig Crawford, is releasing on Amazon in novellas, telling the stories of courageous teams battling against deadly horrors invading our world. And sometimes they don't win. They beat back the monsters in secrecy so the rest of us can live without worrying what might be lurking under our beds. Go to projectthreshold.com and discover more. Join the team to learn about those who fight for us. Get monthly updates, background, free stories, and merch in a newsletter. Check out projectthreshold.com and protect humanity from darkness. So on this edition of Into the Fray, I welcome on listener Dennis. He got in touch with me quite a while ago. We've been trying to touch base and get this done, and finally here we are. Now, Dennis, this is something that happened 40 years ago, you said, right? And you've actually never shared this with anyone. So first of all, thank you for being here to share it with me and my audience. And secondly, why did you decide to finally talk about this?
Well, that's kind of a long, involved story, but I'll give you the short version. This happened when I was 9 years old. You kind of have to give you a little bit of a backstory here. For me, it was never solely about the experience. It became more about what happened afterwards and what it sort of imparted on me as part of the experience. And so because of that, I was always very protective of this story. I kind of held it, even back when I was a kid, almost as this sort of, I don't know, very personal, very almost sacred kind of experience. And I'm not a religious person by any stretch, but there was just something that felt like this was mine and it was mine to hold. And I didn't share it with anybody, not out of fear, for the stigma attached to it or having people say I was crazy or whatever. And quite frankly, I'm not even telling this story to get people to try to believe me. Whether you believe the story or not is irrelevant. It's not my job to try to convince anybody that this happened. I had said to you in one of the original back and forth emails that I couldn't possibly be the only person that has had an experience like this. And I truly believe that, statistically speaking. I mean, just on a mathematical level, it is impossible that I am the sole person walking this planet that has had something like this happen. And as I got older, your perspective sort of changes. Things happen in your life and people come and go and you lose people. And it became more about trying to, not necessarily me try to reach other people, because I really don't want people to contact me about this at all. But other people to say, if this happened or something like this happened to them or something similar, for them to say, okay, I'm not crazy. This actually did happen. And, they're not the only person. And so really I had listened to your podcast before, and as I listened to several podcasts, and it just seemed that yours was not a sensationalized podcast. It was just very matter of factly displayed and aired. There's not a whole lot of pomp and circumstances, and I really didn't want to turn this into sort of like a show. I just wanted to get the story out there. If it resonates with somebody, or if somebody else hears this somewhere out there in the world and they say, "Oh my God, that's something similar to what I experienced," because for a long time, even though I know this happened, over the years you start to question it. Did this in fact happen? Did I see this the way I did? Now I know for a matter of fact, 100%, that this story is accurate. There's no misidentifying. There's no, oh, what could this have been? What happened to me is just factual. And for me, there's no question about it. But over the years, because, and in the interest of full disclosure, this is a subject that I have been a fan of since before I can even remember. I grew up on a steady diet of Universal horror monster movies and that sort of world. That's the kind of thing my dad raised me on. So like this subject was not unknown to me. And I had always had a fascination with cryptids and conspiracies and sort of the world of the unknown. I remember absolutely loving the show In Search Of with Leonard Nimoy when I was a kid. I used to, I can repeat the intro by heart. Funny story. One of the biggest disappointments of my young life was I used to love the $6 Million Man. It's one of my favorite shows. And when they introduced the character of the bionic Bigfoot, I was like, oh my God, this is the greatest thing that's ever happened to me. I mean, it's my two worlds colliding. And then when I found out that this was not, in fact, a cybernetically enhanced Sasquatch, but a robot built by aliens, I was just, as a kid, I was crushed. I was like, oh, this is just so cheap and cheesy.
Yeah.
Seriously, it was just a disappointment. So anyway, I say this because I want it known that this is not a subject that was unfamiliar with me. It's not like I saw something and then was like, well, what the hell was that? And then found out years later, well, it was this. I knew, even at the time when I was 9 years old, what I was staring at. And the other thing, and again, I'm sorry to make this a long drawn out explanation, but it is sort of relevant. And I apologize if I stammer my way through this. Like I said, I've been very protective of the story. I've never told anybody, and you're the first person. And so I'm trying to figure out the best way to narratively tell this story so it doesn't bore people. But again, there is more to this than just the actual encounter. And just to, I promise you, this is the last quick backstory I'll give you. I have a behavioral disorder called depersonalization, and what that is, it's brought on by trauma, and it's sort of like a byproduct of PTSD. And what it is, it's a real thing. I didn't make it up. This is actually diagnosed, and it's this sort of detached feeling, this sense that almost nothing is tangible or real, and it's been going on for a while. And like I said, it's connected to trauma. And the reason there's two reasons why I bring it up. One is because one of the side effects or one of the setbacks from it is that you have it gives you a very sort of base level emotion to everything, to literally everything, because you have this sense of detachment. And to give you a better example of that, in the past year, in November of 2022, I was given a substantial career bump, a really good career bump, good position, great location, great salary. And in the same year, I lost my father suddenly. And both of those events for me registered on the same plane, the same emotional plane. And that's due to this depersonalization, derealization. One of the other things is that it stops me anyway from getting nervous about things. I just don't experience nervousness like most people do. And that's not some cheesy humble brag. It's just an unfortunate side effect. But telling you this story is the first time I've actually been nervous about anything in years. So like I'm sitting here in front of a computer with my hand shaking right now. So if I sound trembly, it's because I am in fact trembly, and it's like it's new sensation for me.
I think you're doing a great job. And you just take your time. Wherever we need to go, whatever you think is relevant, that's where we'll go.
Well, there's another reason why I bring this up, and I'll get to that towards the end of the story, because it's absolutely relevant. I guess let's just dive into it rather than give you any more backstory. I was 9 years old. This was back in the summer of 1981. My mother was kind of a free spirit. She loved the outdoors. She loved taking these like very spontaneous, wild road trip adventures. Most of my vacations with my mother were, hey, get in the car and let's go someplace. And then we would just go someplace. She loved camping. She always had camping equipment with her in the trunk of her car. When I say equipment, I mean it was a giant ratty canvas tent that she got from a yard sale, a couple of lanterns, some extended like metal hot dog forks, and maybe a sleeping bag. Like everything was just sort of spur of the moment, and figure it out when you get there, which was great. I mean, as a kid, you kind of love that. And I remember specifically heading towards Washington D.C. once, and I forget where we were going. We were going someplace in Virginia. We couldn't camp. For some reason, something happened and we couldn't camp. So we pitched the tent and everything else inside a hotel room that we got, because my mother just loved this kind of wacky shenanigans. Anyway, this was the summer of 81. We were south of Mount Rainier. I would prefer not to give you the exact location, but I will say that it was south of Mount Rainier, kind of around the Trout Lake area of Washington. I have since gone back several times, not physically, but like on like Google Maps and all the kind of stuff to remap this entire experience. So I know exactly where it happened. I could tell you exactly what road we turned off of to get to where we were, but it was in the general vicinity of Mount Rainier. And we were actually we had spent the summer driving from Burbank, California to Washington. It was part of this big road trip that my mother had planned. And we stopped at it wasn't a campsite per se. It wasn't a campground. It was a trailhead, the kind of place that it has like a ranger station, like a small ranger station, some parking, a small picnic area type of thing with some grills and a very small playground. But it's really meant as a trailhead. You park and you go in, and you essentially it's rustic pack in, pack out camping. You carry everything in with you. You carry everything out with on your way out. And this was something that we had done several times before. We got there. It was late in the afternoon. It was myself, my mother, and my brother. We unpacked the car. We hiked in. I would say roughly we hiked it was probably about a little less than 2 miles. And on the way in, we passed a family. They had already set up their tents. So it was one trail in, and somewhere along that trail, on the left-hand side of it, there was a family that had already set up camp. Now, my mother was one of these people that made friends everywhere she went. She couldn't go to a gas station without learning everybody's name and inviting somebody over for dinner. And so she saw somebody set up and a family set up, immediately started talking to them, because that was just what she did. And they happened to have a son that was around my age. He was 1 year younger than me. But so it was like one of this, and you have to kind of remember that this is back in the early 80s. So it wasn't uncommon for kids to just go off and play. You know what I mean? It's kind of like a lost art these days, but like at the time, it was not uncommon where your parents would just say, go outside and play and don't come back until dinner. And so we had sort of made plans after talking to my mother was going to meet up with this other couple and hang out and cook and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I was going to hang out with the kid. And so we found a spot, a clearing. We set up camp. My mother started cooking, and that was it for the rest of the day. That we just, it was getting late. We stayed up, we had dinner, and then we went to sleep. The next morning I got up, and after breakfast, which was just essentially cereal, I said, I'm going to go hang out with that kid. And I walked down to his spot, his site where they were hanging out. And we were just being kids. We were just hanging out, a 9-year-old and an 8-year-old. We went down to the playground. We were, doing whatever there was to be done there. While we were on the playground, somebody from the trailhead who was running the trailhead, somebody I just remember them driving an older truck, had started talking to us, and they said, if you follow this trail, the only trail that was there, if you follow that, you'll get to the top of the mountain. Now, I found out later that it wasn't actually, like, it's not really a mountain. And I only found this out later after, looking at like Google Maps, but our path was on an incline. So I thought, okay, this goes to the top of the mountain. And we said, we were just kids being kids, and we decided, right then and there, we're going to go up to the top of the mountain. We're going to go see the top of the mountain. It was just this like major adventure that we were going to do. And we walked from the playground past his campsite. He told his parents that, we were going to go walking. We then passed my site, and I told my mom we were going to go to the top of the mountain, and we started walking. And I'd say we probably walked about another 3/4 of a mile before this kid just decided he didn't want to do it anymore. For whatever reason, he just said, no, I'm going to go back to my site. And I said, okay. And I turned around and went back with him. But I had told him, almost in a bragging way, that, oh, tomorrow I'm going to go to the top of the mountain, and you're too scared to do it. And just kids being kids. And that was essentially that. I told my mom that, the following day I was going to go do this. Again, I have to reiterate that, like, this is back when kids were like allowed to do this. I know a lot of people are probably like, well, I would never allow my child to go walking on their own in a strange forest, but this was not uncommon in these situations. It was just something we did. My mother was very strict about making sure we knew, both my brother and myself knew how to navigate through the outdoors. And that meant, like, in forest situations, in water. I mean, I took my first swimming lesson when I was, I think, 4 years old. So she wanted us to know these things. And she gave us all kinds of lectures about how to find your way, looking for specific landmarks when you're on a trail, and what to do if you get lost, and how to find, directional observances and things like that. So it's not like this was a particularly uncommon situation. Anyway, the next morning we got up, had breakfast, and I said to my mom, I'm going to go walk this trail. I'm going to go to the top of the mountain. And she had said, okay, well, lunch is at this time and dinner is at this time. So if you don't make it back, there's no food until tomorrow. And again, this was just my mom being my mom. She was it was important to instill, like, responsibility and that kind of thing in us. And so I set out. It was probably about 11 o'clock in the morning. And I just remember walking on this trail. I was just walking, and there was nothing spectacular about it. It was just it could have been a trail anywhere, but it was on a continuous incline. And so, I remember walking, and I remember doing what my mother had always taught us, to look for things that would be recognizable on the way back, even though it was just one single path in and the same path back out. It was, it just becomes a habit. Like, oh, that tree stump looks like a face, so that when you see it on the way back, that the tree stump that looks like a face, you're on the right path back. So I remember doing that with a bunch of things. I remember doing that with some knots in a tree. I remember doing that with some, clumpings of grass. And I was probably walking for about a little over an hour. I noticed that up in front of me, however many yards, it looked like the trees came to a clearing. The trees in front of me sort of got a little bit sparse, and then there was this almost yellow color that looked like a meadow. So it looked like the trail was going up and it was leading directly into a meadow. But there were still trees. I couldn't see the exactly what it was, but that's what it looked like. And before the meadow, the path curved to the right around this big sort of outcropping of rocks. They started out smaller, and as they got to this turn, to this curve, they got bigger and bigger. So that by the time the they hit that turn, the actual kind of curve in the path, it was probably about 12 feet high worth of these big sort of stones. Now I do this thing. It's like a habit when I'm walking or doing whatever. I'm always kind of looking like in a 3/4 angle down. So it's kind of like front and not directly in front of me, but sort of like looking at the ground, but looking ahead of me. And it's just, I don't know why I do it. It's just something I've always done. I remember walking and I remember seeing the path, the curve up ahead in the path. And this is kind of hard to explain. It almost seemed like everything changed. Everything sort of took on, and this just might be how I remember it now as, an adult, but things started to gradually almost become almost dreamlike in a way. I can tell you everything about this day, and I can tell you matter of factly that, like, I got to a certain point on this path and there was just no sound. Like, I didn't hear anything. I didn't hear any birds. I didn't hear any ambient noises. I didn't feel any air. Like, I didn't feel a breeze. And I remember specifically looking down at like a cluster of ferns, and only a very small patch of them were blowing in the wind. But there was no wind, and it was only this one small cluster. The ones around it weren't moving. These were, though. And I remember thinking, well, that's weird. And I don't feel anything. But, as a kid, I didn't put any stock into it whatsoever. It just seemed strange. And so I kept walking up this path, and I wasn't, nothing was eerie. It just, like I said, it just felt different. And as I got closer to the turn, the curve, I was about 30 feet away, and I started to get, not scared, anxious, I guess is the right word. I just started to feel anxious, and not dissimilar from what I'm actually feeling now. And I took a few more steps, and I remember hearing something in my head saying, "Look up." It wasn't an external voice, and it wasn't a voice in my head. It was a feeling. It was just this intuition sense telling me to look up right now, look up. And I did. And all I did was fix my eyes forward rather than, that's all I did. I just went from looking 3/4 at the ground to looking straight ahead of me. And the second I did, and the second my eyes focused on what was in front of me, this thing stepped out from behind this rock outcropping. Now, everything from this point felt deliberate. It's the only way I can explain it. It felt deliberate because it didn't step out like it didn't know I was there. It stepped out knowing full well that I was there, because it put one foot down and then pivoted its body like almost in a half circle to then put its other foot down. So it was one foot, turns its body, and then plants its other foot down, and it just stands there. And I'm no more than 25 feet away from this thing. This wasn't seeing something through the trees. This wasn't an elusive black mass 1,000 feet away. This was right in front of me. This was right here. There's no mistaking what I was looking at. It wasn't a bear, and it wasn't somebody in a ghillie suit. It wasn't a costume, and it was not. It wasn't elusive. There was nothing. There was nothing about this that was trying to hide. In fact, everything about, like I said, everything felt deliberate. It seemed like the point was to see it because it didn't do anything. It just stood there, and I just stood there, and I just stood there looking at it, and it just stood there looking at me. I was close enough where I could tell you, I could describe the creases on its hand. I could tell you what its fingernails looked like. That's how not elusive this was. The obvious question would be, well, weren't you scared? And that's the important part of this story for me. Obviously, the experience is important, but I've never been more calm before or since than I was in that moment. In the minutes that I stood there, I never felt more calm, or more at peace, or more safe. And I can't tell you why. I have no explanation for that whatsoever. And that is all there is to well, I mean, there's more to the sighting, but that's the important thing that I came away with. It was never a question, after this, it was never a question of, do these things exist? Because I'm staring right at one. It's right there, and it's looking at me, and it's not moving. It's intentionally making itself known. And so I stood there, and it stood there, and it was I know this sounds ridiculous, and it's funny because saying this story out loud for the first time, I can honestly hear how ridiculous this sounds, but it seems like it gave me all the time I needed to take in what I was supposed to see. And then it made this huff sound, this deep kind of sound, and it rolled its shoulders back, and it just turned around and walked back where it came from. And the reason I brought up, and I'll be more than happy to describe it in any way you want, but the reason I brought up the depersonalization at the start of this is because, like I had said, that was brought on by a trauma that happened in my life, a very significant trauma, and it is a symptom. It is symptomatic of PTSD. When I was going through all the stuff that I was dealing with related to this trauma, therapists and analysts and people and doctors, they give you they try to give you an emotional toolbox to use for when you're having problems, and they routinely tell you to reach into your toolbox and use whatever you can. I have used that feeling of calm that I experienced in those moments throughout my entire life. Very specifically reaching back into that moment and using that sense of safety to get me to today, to this very point right now. And to answer your original question, why am I telling the story? That's the reason. That's exactly the reason. It's because somewhere out there, there's probably somebody that experienced something like this, but doesn't really know what to do with it, or are questioning if it in fact actually happened, or struggling in some sense, because I know I did. But that sense of peace and serenity that I felt in that space, in that moment, and again, I can't explain to you why. I don't know. Has literally saved my life. There's that's not an exaggeration. That's literally been my main tool in my emotional toolbox to get me to this very point. So I don't know if that makes any sense to anybody whatsoever.
I mean, I think that's one of the coolest Bigfoot encounters I've heard, as far as it being very unique. And you said that it was, and it sure as heck is. I do have questions, though. Of course, I jotted some things
Right.
down.
Please ask, because I'm getting tired of hearing my own voice.
No, yo, you shouldn't. You're a very good storyteller, by the way. Okay, so you said you're 25 feet away. Of course, you know what this
Mhm.
thing is. Can you describe every detail that you can remember of him or her?
Okay. Yes. So now, again, this was not unknown to me, and to further that point, I this is going to sound so stupid. So I grew up reading these books. I was always a fan, and I was a fan in the way that other kids were a fan of, say, like, you know Reggie Jackson or Darryl Strawberry or Mickey Mantle. I didn't care at all about sports, but damn, I was a Bigfoot fan. I used to tell people that I was Roger Patterson reincarnated, because he died the same year I was born. And the Patterson Gimlin film was filmed on my mother's birthday. And so I've always felt like I had this really weird. Now, I don't believe that, by the way. I just, as a kid, it was just something stupid to say. But because I was such a fan, I would always like relay these ridiculous, useless, trivia facts to other people like they meant something. And I knew, it's dumb. I don't actually believe that, but I did think the coincidence was kind of funny. And October 20th was in fact my mother's birthday. And so again, I was not unfamiliar with this lore, nor was I unfamiliar with what I was looking at. So I know the popular description of this thing is usually 7 to 8 feet tall. This was bigger. This was at least 9 feet. And I can say that with absolute certainty, because even now, I can close my eyes and I can see this thing in any environment you put me in. So, and I've done this thousands and thousands of times. If I'm like walking on a trail somewhere or anywhere, even if I'm walking in the city, I can visualize this thing standing against a building, or I can visualize it standing against a pole or a tree or something. And I can give you measurements. And it was bigger than 8 feet. It was at least twice my width, my current width. And as a kid, you probably could have fit seven of me as 9-year-olds in this thing. It was massive. It was, there's no other word for it. It's massive. It's a literal monster, but it's not. And that was one of the physical takeaways. It, it's always referred to as a monster. It's referred to as a creature. It's referred to as a whatever. It's not. This thing had reason. It. I hate to say that it was wise, but this was not an animal. It wasn't. An animal does not look at you the way this thing looked at me. It doesn't behave the way. There was no confusion. There was no alarmed behavior. It was deliberate in absolutely everything it did. Everything. It knew what it was doing. There's no way it didn't know that I was there before it came out from behind this rock. And it moved very deliberately. Everything was deliberate. It was a combination of light brown, dark brown, reddish brown, and gray hair. Gray at the tips on everything. Gray at the tips on the wrists, in the beard, at the bottom of the feet, and in the chest. It was complete. The closest approximation I could give to you is, if I were going to use some sort of Hollywood standard. I haven't seen anybody that really got it quite right yet. Oddly enough, the Jack Link's jerky messing with Sasquatch is somewhat close in the way the face was structured, I guess you could say, but not maniacal looking. Like this was not a sinister thing. It just wasn't. Like it was peaceful. it was just peaceful. I know that's a very weak word to use in this situation, but I don't have the words to accurately describe the look on it. I could describe it physically. It had all the things that you've heard: a pronounced brow, sunken eyes, broad shoulders, giant chest, a more tapered waist than you would think. It wasn't necessarily barrel shaped. It had a definition. Shorter legs than you would imagine something of this proportion to have, but thick, giant. I mean, massive is the only word I could use. Very, very long arms. Its hands looked like the same material as a well-worn baseball glove, for a lack of a better descriptor. It was leathery and thick. I've heard stories where people say, oh, they would pull a gun on one if they saw one. I can't imagine a rifle doing anything to this thing. Like, and I'm not a gun person, so I can't really say that with any authority. I don't know what actual guns are capable of doing, but I sure as hell would never have pulled a gun on this thing, first and foremost because it looks like a person. Its eyes were knowing. It was knowing. It knew. It had very, like, almost old looking eyes, a palish, like, brown color. The skin underneath the eyes was darker than the skin on its face. It had a very wide nose. It had a row of, they weren't, I guess jagged's not the right word for the teeth. They weren't exactly straight, but they weren't crooked either. And they certainly weren't fangs. They were just teeth. It had a larger lower lip, or a lip type area. I mean, ask away, I'll tell you anything.
Boy, you really saw that thing, didn't you? Really close. Holy smokes.
I again, like, I'm sure I mentioned this to you in one of our emails. Because I follow this, like, I follow these stories. I'm a fan. I follow the Bigfoot Reddits and whatever, and I always hear these stories, and like shows like Finding Sasquatch or whatever, and I hear these stories about people going out into the wilderness late at night, and they hear a wood knock, or they hear some sort of howl or something, or they somebody's filming something on a mountaintop that's 6,000 feet away, and they're claiming that this is whatever. I can't connect to those stories at all at any point. I can't. I don't. To me, these are the people that are just looking for something. Because again, I cannot be the only person that this has happened to. It's impossible, statistically speaking. It is impossible that I'm the only person that this thing approached. I didn't approach it. It could have run away, and it didn't. And so I don't. I'm just trying to reach those people. Like, somebody else somewhere along the lines has had to have a similar situation. This thing didn't run. It wanted to be seen, and I just happened to be the person that saw it. Now, there's also a lot of people out there that like to say that these are interdimensional creatures, and they come through portals, and you could find a family of them at a cookout on Skinwalker Ranch. This was very, very physical. There was nothing metaphysical about any of this. The only spiritual part of this is what I took away from it afterwards, and the feeling that I had in that moment. But what I was staring at was very physical. It was as real as the microphone in front of me.
So as you're talking, I'm thinking about, as you said, it was very deliberate, it stepped out. I'm thinking, well, why you, Dennis, right? Why you? And then I'm thinking, and people are going to yell at their phone or wherever they're listening to this. And that's okay, because this is going to go into the woo, and that's all right. Let's just go there. So what if because you put all of this stuff out into the universe, you know, your mom's birthday, and you're the reincarnated Roger Patterson, which is super cool, by the way, for a kid to even come up with that or even know who that is and be in love with that, I think is fantastic. What if because you put all that out into the universe, and as I said, this is super woo stuff, that then it got this vibe from you as you are in the forest somehow, and that is why you had this also super positive experience, because by all accounts, describing the size of this thing, and you were out there alone, and you had hiked back there quite a ways, there would be no one there to save you. This thing could have just plucked you right off the ground. No one would have been the wiser. You should have been absolutely terrified, and you were not. So, I don't know. That was just something I thought of. Let me know your thoughts on that.
So, a couple of things. One, you're absolutely right. If this thing was, out to get me, it could have, with half of a hand, it could have palmed my head like a basketball. I mean, and I mean that sincerely. There's a very famous photograph of Andre the Giant holding a 12-ounce beer can, and the can disappears in his hand because his hand was so massive. This thing's hand was bigger than that. So if you want to Google that photograph, imagine that the hand that I was staring at was in fact bigger. Now here's the thing. I had said that, people like to believe, some people believe that these are interdimensional creatures that travel through portals, and it's very hypocritical of me to sit here and say, well, that's just ridiculous, because this entire story that I'm telling you can be deemed ridiculous. And who am I to say, well, no, this happened to me and this is accurate, but these other stories aren't. It just makes me a giant hypocrite. I can't question any of these things. I can't question the existence of, what is it? The 72 different types of alien races that have visited the planet, according to people in the CIA. I can't question the existence of chupacabras or the Loch Ness Monster or any of those things, the Flatwoods Monster. Like I just can't, because who am I to say that those things didn't actually happen? I can't speak to those things. And so to say that, I had put this out into the universe and that's why, sure. I mean, I would never say that that's not I couldn't possibly say that that's not a reason. I'm not the authority on these things. I'm not a religious person. I do consider myself to be somewhat spiritual. I do believe in things like law of attraction and stuff like that. But so maybe, anything's possible. I mean, who's to say that that is not what happened? And then, the flip side of that coin is maybe this was a gigantic bear, and in my mind, I just mistook it for, something else. But that's also not the case. Just like I don't really believe that I'm, the Roger Patterson reincarnated. This was not a bear. This was exactly what people said it was. So yeah, I simply just can't discount any of it. It would make me a hypocrite, and I'm just not in that position to say, that's impossible, because I've never heard another story like mine before. And part of the reason why I'm so invested in this topic is because I'm searching for something else that's not a tree knock or a howl at night, or, the other night I live up in the mountains now. And I just moved here, and I experienced my first coyote howls the other night, and it was a pack of them, and it was terrifying. It sounded like a bunch of little girls screaming.
Yeah.
And so I can imagine somebody hearing that and not knowing what it is, and saying, oh, that's clear, that's a Bigfoot. But somebody else out there has to have had something like this. It's impossible I'm the only one.
Well, and I hope someone reaches out to me with said story, because we hear a lot of times of people running, screaming, or never going in the woods again, right? Or waiting 10, 20, 30 years to do so. Like their favorite pastime is ruined, hunting is ruined, and they can't go out in the woods again. We hear that a lot, right? So yours is definitely very refreshing to hear compared to kind of the par for the course with the Bigfoot stories. Not that I'm making fun of anybody that runs screaming from one of these things. I mean, considering the description that you gave, right? Okay, so you mentioned that right before you kind of had this strong feeling to look up. You said you were in fact a little anxious. Now, once it turned and walked away, and you have this incredible calm feeling, did the anxiousness come back once it was gone?
So it turned and it walked, and I can hear it walking, and that's how I know this thing was very, very physical. Yeah, you can hear it stomping away. And I stood there, and about 10 or 15 seconds later, I was overcome with the most unbelievable sense of sadness that I have ever experienced up until that point. And I mean, it was like a tidal wave of sadness. And I stood there and I started to tear up. And I wasn't crying. I was just sad. I was just really, really sad. And I was sad, and I turned around and I started walking back. And I was sad the whole way. And I don't know why. I don't know what caused me to be sad. Again, it's hard to explain because it's a little bit more than sadness. It was almost a sense of like loneliness. And I walked back feeling this way. And I remember seeing my campsite coming into view. And I started crying uncontrollably, crying. And as soon as I saw the campsite come into view, I sprinted to this campsite. I sprinted to my mother, and she was there. She immediately went into full panic mode. What's wrong? What's wrong? Are you okay? What happened? What happened? Are you hurt? What happened? And she was holding me by my shoulders and, sort of looking me over to see if was I bleeding? Did I break something? And she said, "Did you get lost?" And I said, "Yes, I got lost." And that was the first thing that I could think of to say. Like, those were the first words. Yes, I got lost. And I hadn't gotten lost. There was no way to get lost. But that was all I could think of at that time. And I just stood there with her crying, and she just kept consoling me. "It's okay. You got back. You made it back. You found your way back to camp. Everything's okay. Everything's okay." And I didn't feel as safe at that particular moment. I didn't feel like I was sad, and I felt almost lonely, but I felt a little bit less safe, which is weird because you're with your mother, and where are you ever safer than with your mom? And it's not like I felt unsafe. It just was just a sense of not feeling the same. But immediately after this thing walked away, I mean, it was like a tidal wave that hit me. I mean, almost as if you could hear it hit. Yeah. And I wasn't, definitely not anxious, definitely not scared, just like almost like alone, like a little kid that had gotten lost in a department store, that kind of thing.
Wow, yeah, the calm was enough, like shocking enough to me, but now this sadness afterward, I don't really know what to make of this, to be honest with you, Dennis. I definitely haven't heard anything like this.
Well, I've never heard anything remotely like this. I don't know. I really, I can't. Over the years, I have tried to piece it together pragmatically, and I've done it several times, hundreds of times probably. And I always come back to the same thing. It's one of these situations where there's no point in trying to see the logic or the whys of it all. It's always just been accept that it was, and and without getting too sort of new agey, accept what it was and be grateful for it. And I am, I really am. And like I said, this, that it's become a major tool in my emotional toolbox. And there's a part of me that thought that, and maybe even still thinks to this day, that like, you were supposed to see this because years later you're going to need this. You're going to need this because of the reality is, and I'm not making light of this by any means. I mean this in all sincerity. There are times where I was lower than any person should ever be. I was on a suicide watch. It got heavy. And I don't know that I would have made it without having those tools and that, part of it to help me through it, to know that there is, because there's a big difference between depression and desperation. When you're depressed, you feel depressed. It's almost like a sense of lethargy. When you experience desperation, you don't know anything else besides being desperate. Like, it's the only thing that you know. And so having this feeling, this emotion, like locked and ready to go, knowing that it was there, knowing that it existed, knowing that I could access it when I needed to, was unbelievably helpful. I mean, it was life-saving. So maybe there's that. Maybe it's you were meant to do it because you're going to need this later in life. I don't know. I honestly don't know. I have no answers for that.
So you're able to mentally, if not almost physically, maybe in a way, put yourself back in that calm space that you felt when you were in front of this thing?
Yep, absolutely.
That is a very cool tool to have in the tool bag, right?
Well, yeah, but I mean, it's a crappy superpower to even need.
I don't know. I think a lot of people could use a superpower like that. I mean, it's not invisibility, but hey, it's pretty cool. Now, Dennis, you didn't have any desire at all to tell your mom what actually happened a week later, a month later, 10 years later?
I've never had any desire to tell anybody ever. I was, because of I guess at the time I didn't really realize why I was doing this, but because of the emotional experience, more so than the physical. And don't get me wrong, the physical experience of this is incredible. But for me, the takeaway was always the emotional experience of it all. Because of that, and the reason why I'm not giving out the exact location and et cetera, is because I have been very, very protective of this story. Intentionally protective. It didn't feel like this was mine to give away. It felt like this was mine to protect. But the component of this story that literally saved my life, if it's as the ability to help someone else, then I don't have the right to hold on to it. It shouldn't be for me. It should be for somebody else. Somebody else should be able, if they need it, to benefit from this story. And that's really why I'm telling you.
Have you ever been back to that very same spot on that trail?
No, I've wanted to go. I've not even been back to the area. I've been close. And it's one of these like bucket list things, one of these days I'm going to go back, but I know it's there, and I know exactly where it is, and I can probably find it I'd need GPS, but I don't live anywhere near it. I live in a completely different state. Yeah. So I've never been back. I have thought about it a lot, but it's like, did you see the remake of Point Break?
No, I saw parts of it, but I refuse to watch the remake of Point Break. They should have never done it.
Exactly. And that's my point. Going back would be the remake of Point Break. There's no real reason. I'm not going to see Patrick Swayze. Keanu Reeves is not going to be there.
Yeah.
There's no reason for me to go back.
I can understand that. Right. So you get back and it's, well, how long were you gone? Did you miss lunch, dinner? What did you miss there in camp?
I was gone for I was gone for almost 2 hours. Okay.
And then you guys...
I missed lunch.
Missed lunch. Okay. And then did you guys leave that evening, or did you spend the night there?
No, we spent 2 more days there.
Oh, 2 more days. So Did
Mhm.
your feeling of extreme sadness lift, and then did you feel anxious? How did you feel the rest of the time there?
Yeah, I went to bed and I slept, uh, pardon the pun, but I slept like a baby, and I woke up and everything was back to whatever you can consider a normal being. But I mean, it was still, obviously, it's not like this disappeared. It's not like I was thinking about it constantly. The but I wasn't anxious, I wasn't scared, I wasn't sad anymore. I was sort of like, I guess, more in the moment. It was a long, long, long time before it wasn't my preeminent thought, like waking up and going to sleep. You know what I mean? Like, it was
Hmm.
just one of these pervasive thoughts and memories. And it was a long time before that started to disappear. But it never, it every every single time I read a story or I see something, or I see this character appear in pop culture, and I drive around with a Bigfoot sticker on the back of my car just because, like I said, I'm a fan. It does take me back to that moment. Like, it does become very fresh, and it's never really become stale. I mean, it's something that's always, it's not always top of mind, but I could always access it anytime I want. And again, I can close my eyes and I can see everything about. I can see it. I can tell you everything about the day. I can tell you things about the path. I can tell you, what I was wearing. All of that. I couldn't tell you what I had for breakfast 2 days ago, but I could tell you, something that happened 40 years ago.
Right. You described walking up this trail and that everything changed. It became kind of dreamlike. There was no sound, really no air that you could even feel. Even it felt devoid of air, which we have heard things like that before, right? Like things just go stale and there's no sound, there's no wind moving, nothing like that. But you did say that there was one cluster of ferns that in fact were moving. Now, what do you make of that? Or does it have some sort of a mundane explanation, like there was a little squirrel in it or something? Like what is that?
I Realistically, it probably has a mundane explanation, but again, I can't say that with any sort of authority, and I couldn't. If somebody were to sit there and tell me, no, the reason that this cluster of ferns was moving was because tiny little extraterrestrials from Venus were living in it and they were building an apartment complex, who am I to say no, that's not possible? You know what I mean? Like you could give me the craziest explanation, and the part of me would have to say, well, I guess it's possible.
Right.
More than likely, it's probably a mundane thing, and it was probably, yes, everything did take on sort of like almost like a dreamlike quality, but I guess a better way to explain that was like somebody just hit pause. Like they just hit the pause button, but I was not frozen. Everything else was, but I was moving through a world that somebody had just hit pause on,
Mm.
except for this one little cluster of ferns, and it was probably whatever, ants or a chipmunk or whatever. But I didn't see anything. I just noticed that in this scope of nothing happening, this was happening.
Well, and in the scope of everything that happened, chances are it's not a mundane explanation, right? But that stood out to me. I'm like,
Yeah.
why did that one cluster of ferns keep moving or start to move, whatever it was? That definitely stood out to me. So you live in the mountains now, 40 years later. I mean, would you want to see one again? Or are you worried that this next experience would be completely different and maybe very, very negative for you?
Um, No, I don't have any. I mean, yeah, I mean, obviously, yes, I would love to see another one. I'd love to see a family of them. I'd love to go outside every day and see one. But I don't worry that the next experience would be negative. I don't. I mean, I can only speak from experience, and so my experience tells me that there's nothing there's nothing to be afraid of with these things. They're just there. They're like anything else that's just there. And so my experience tells me that there's no reason to be nervous or apprehensive or have anything to worry about. Now, that being said, I have heard stories where that's not the case. But no, I don't have any fear that, if I were to see one again, that it would be a bad experience. I did. I don't, under any circumstances, think it would be the same experience. I don't think, one would come up to me and be like, "Oh, hey, you met my cousin." I don't think it would be like that. But I don't know, and that's why I question, these people that, they see something, or they said they saw something, and it immediately, whatever, ran away, or or they couldn't quite tell what it was, or the story I hear more often than not is, it was a quick flash of black or brown fur, and it happened out of the corner of my eye, and by the time I got myself situated, it was gone. This thing didn't have. I mean, and obviously, I was a kid. I was 9 years old. It didn't have anything to fear from me, and I can't imagine it being necessarily afraid of anything. I mean, this was a giant. This was a literal giant. At 9 feet tall, it's very tough to imagine that this thing would be afraid of a 5.5 foot man. But I don't know. I mean, it's not like I had a sit down conversation with it. But it's weird. I almost got the sense that you could, like, it wouldn't be an English speaking conversation, but almost like it would know what you were saying, like it would understand. And I thought about that, in the years prior. I wonder how much of what we do, we being people, it understands. Obviously, I'm sure it doesn't understand our language. Who knows? Maybe it does. But I wonder what if it understands, like, what we're doing.
So then, do you think that the feeling, this very strong pull to look up, was just primal instinct?
I think so. Yeah, I think so. If I had to guess, I would say yeah.
Yeah. I also wonder in Bigfoot speak what the huff meant, or if it's just breathing loud and we're just reading too much into it. I just wonder if it meant, and I don't know.
Yeah, I got the sense it was telling me time's up.
He's bored with you.
Yeah.
Okay.
It was just like, all right. It's like, because I mean, so this whole encounter was about just a little over 2 minutes long, and in that 2 minutes, it did not do anything. Just, it stood there, and it was, like I said, and I can't really express this enough, but because everything just felt so deliberate, it was almost like, here I am, take this all in as much as you can, because time's limited. Now, I didn't feel that. I didn't feel the whole sense of time being limited at the time, but I did get the sense, the very, very strong sense, that, like, it was like, take a look up, and really take in what you're seeing.
Did its facial expression ever change while it was standing there and you guys are staring at each other?
No, not really. I mean, it opened its mouth slightly, and that's how I saw its teeth. But it didn't. It didn't have any real expression. Like, I wouldn't say it looked mean, or I wouldn't say it looked scared. It looked like somebody that was the way you would observe something, like the way you would if you were bird watching, and you were trying to stay quiet and still, and you were observing a bird, or just sort of that general sense of it's hard to explain. It didn't seem particularly interested, if that makes sense. But at the same time, it also didn't seem particularly obligated to stay. It just was staring. I mean, that's the best. It didn't really have an expression on its face.
But it did choose to step out, though, in the first place. As you said, you could have just walked on by. It could have just stayed where it was.
Yeah. And that's why there are a lot of these things that a lot of these details that I could question myself on, or other people could question me on. But the one thing that I can state almost as 100% fact was that this thing stepped out so that I could see it. Everything else, like, if you say, I said that, the hair, the tips of its hair in certain locations were turning gray. Okay, well, was it actually gray, or was it white? Was it just a light tan? Was it, so these are questions people could quiz me on. And it's probably another reason why I've never really talked about this, because I just don't care to answer these questions, or repeatedly. But the deliberate nature of all of this is something I am positive about. I'm absolutely positive about it. For me, there's just no question. This came out because it wanted to be seen. And I don't know why. I have no idea why, because animals don't behave that way. I've never been walking on a trail and a deer just pranced in front of me and, be like, hey, abracadabra, I'm here. It just doesn't happen that way. And that's one of the reasons why, I've heard this before. I've heard this story before where people would draw a gun on it and they wouldn't shoot because it acted too human or it looked too human. Everything about this thing's face was human. It was haggard, very grizzled looking human, but it was human. And the theory that this is a gigantopithecus is ridiculous, because this was not an ape. This was a person, just a very, very, I can't say it was a person, but it was not, it was more human-like than it was ape-like. It was just a very, very big ape-like human, but it was not a human-like ape.
There's no way to know this, of course, but I do wonder if you were not alone that day, if the kid had, had the stones to walk up there with you, or if you had happened to be walking up there with your mom, would he have stepped out at all,
I don't think so. And you're right. There's no way to know that, but I don't think so. Just something about it, just, instinctively, I really don't think so. I never made it to the top of the mountain, though.
I bet. I don't blame you. I would, even after the calmness, once you have that sadness hit you, you're going, okay, time to go back. Yeah. I wonder if the other kid, though, do you think and this is, again, probably way reaching, not that we know anyway, but I wonder if he got some kind of a weird feeling the day before, and that's why he turned around and fiended, like, oh, I just don't feel like going. He probably just didn't feel like going, but I don't know.
No, it's, anything is possible. Like I said, I've always been interested in this topic and topics that are adjacent to this. I remember reading books, like as a kid, I remember reading books on like ESP and things like that. I remember being fascinated by people like Uri Geller, who could claim to bend spoons with his mind. This is always a topic and adjacent topics that, that I've always been interested in. And so it is my firm belief, and I have no way to back this up. I'm not a scientist, and I'm not any kind of a doctor, but it just, in terms of simple belief and faith, it is my belief that there is far more out there than what we can see with, see, feel, and touch. I just have to believe that this isn't it. You know what I mean? Like, this can't just be it, what we see and what we hear every day. There has to be more out there that we're not able to process for one reason or another. There's stuff that we can't see. There's stuff we can't hear, but it is there. And so maybe this kid did see that. Maybe this kid did feel that. Maybe there was maybe he did have some sort of ominous feeling. Maybe the voice that told me to look up told him to turn around and go home. I don't know. I didn't see him again, so I don't know. And it's funny because, I often thought about, like, what if my brother had gone along with me, because he is such a non-factor in all of this, because he hates, or hated, these trips. He's not an outdoors person. He's a stay inside and play video games, even to this day, type of person. And it's so funny how, like, just growing up, because if this was a trip with my father, it never would have happened. My father was the exact opposite. He would never take a trip that wasn't 100% planned to the nth degree, nor would he ever go camping. Everything was 5-star hotels. And everything about it, literally everything about it is like, every step was the right step to put me in the position to put me in this path, in its path, at that cropping of rocks by that curve in that trail on the side of that hill. Everything put me there. And so what is that? I don't think it's coincidence. I don't believe in coincidence. I really don't believe in coincidence. I think coincidence is a lazy way to explain something, or it's a coward's way to explain something. So none of this, I can't question anything connected to it. Everything that happened put me right where I was supposed to be. So, yeah, I again, anything is possible, and that's the other thing that really sort of opened my eyes to the bigger world around me. If this happened, what else is out there? Like, what else is possible? What other things are going on that either don't get reported or underreported, or somebody reports and they get laughed at? It's interesting on many levels to try to just sort of sit there and question that. Like, well, what is that about? Or what, why is it this way? What does this? Why do we X, Y, and Z? I was watching a video, and not to get off topic, but a friend of mine sent me a video, and he was laughing about it. And it was this guy, this older gentleman, who claimed he could materialize UFOs on command. He said that a voice had come to him one day and had given him instructions and told him how to materialize UFOs. So he was making these claims, and a local news crew came out because they were going to do almost like a piece where they were making fun of him. Like, oh, and local blah 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 claims he could materialize UFOs with his mind. Let's see what he's got to say. And they send a reporter out there. This guy can't explain why he can do this. He just knows that he can. He heard a voice, and one day he tried it, and every time he's done it since, he can materialize these things in the sky. And the reporter starts out with a very snarky sort of intro and says to the guy, okay, Alakazam, let's see what you can do. And the guy does it. He says a little prayer, and 3 minutes later, this big white orb appears in the sky. And the cameraman is now focusing on the reporter. And the reporter gets on the phone and calls his editor and says, we got to change the story. This guy is doing exactly what he says he can do. Like, I'm staring right at it. We have it on film. And there's actually precedent for that. There's a guy named Dr. Stephen Greer, who has his detractors, and I'm actually one of them, but claims that this is possible, that these things that we are experiencing, that people are claiming are extraterrestrial, are in fact interdimensional or transdimensional. And they're there. We just can't see them. Now, how do we know that's true? We don't. But is it possible? Sure, of course it's possible. Why wouldn't it not be possible? Who's to say that that's not possible? But to me, for someone to say that's impossible is like saying that there's no such thing as God. Like, I'm not religious, but I could never sit here and say that there's no such thing as God. How the hell do I know? It's very narrow-minded to think that that the only thing that's out there is what we see and what we hear. There has to be more. It just has to be.
Well, you mentioned Trout Lake, Washington. I mean, that's the site of the ECETI Ranch, where they do exactly what you just talked about that gentleman doing. The guy who can call the UFOs. They do that at ECETI. They see orbs, full craft UFOs, and then Bigfoot is sighted at ECETI Ranch as well. So people actually go there and camp just to have these experiences. So I'd like to go try that sometime.
I am interested in all of these things from a inquisitive point of view, and from some of them from like an ironic point of view, and some of them from just a simply playful point of view. So I've been, I take these motorcycle road trips. It's funny because I had mentioned when I walk, I always look like 3/4 down, like half in front of me and half at the ground. When I started to learn how to ride a motorcycle, I had to train myself not to do that, because when you ride, you have to look past where you're going. So you have to look at the road. You have to look straight ahead of you. and they tell you have to point the bike where you want to go, not where you are and not where you're going, but where you want to go. And it's a safety thing because you always aim through a curve instead of turning the bike. It's a whole thing. But anyway, I had to retrain myself not to look down, because that's how you get into an accident, by looking kind of at the road in front of you and not at the road 500 feet in front of you. And so over the years, I've taken trips, solo motorcycle trips, where I'll just like fly into a city, rent a motorcycle, and then spend 5 or 6, sometimes 7 days out on the road. And I used to do it just for fun. I would fly into Vegas because it's a great hub to all the other areas. Once you get out of Vegas proper, beautiful roads for riding. But then over the years, I started to make them into these like crypto pilgrimages. So the last one I did was to Devil's Tower, because I wanted to see Devil's Tower, and it was fun. It was great. And I did the extraterrestrial highway, and drove past the black mailbox and stopped at the Little Alien for lunch. And yeah, so I want to see these areas. I want to my next one that I'm trying to plan for next year is I want to fly into Portland, Oregon. I want to ride up to Astoria to see the Goonies house, and then I want to ride the coast all the way down to Bluff Creek. So that's my big one. That's like my big Sasquatch pilgrimage. But I do want to see some of those other areas. I'd like to drive along the road where Skinwalker Ranch is, and it's just because, for me, this is my version of going across the country and stopping at every baseball stadium. Like, I don't care about sports, I don't care about baseball, but for me, this is interesting. It's exciting, and whether or not any of this is true is almost irrelevant. I mean, even this story that I'm telling you now, whether it's true or not, and to be clear, it is, but whether it's true or not it's almost irrelevant if the bigger picture to this, if somebody's bigger picture is, hey, you know what, I'm struggling and I can find my way out of it. Maybe that's the part that matters. Maybe it's somebody had a very similar situation and a similar experience, and they've never talked about it because they didn't want to be called crazy. So there's a lot of different components to it. And again, the reason why I wanted to talk to you specifically was because there weren't, your podcast is not, it's not a lot of pop and circumstance. It's very matter of fact stories. There, you don't have a puppet on the side that's delivering quippy commentary. You know what I mean? Like, it's not one of those shows. And that's why I really wanted to, I figured if I was going to go ahead and tell this story, I would do it someplace that was more serious than some of the other ones.
Well, thanks, Dennis. I appreciate that very much. I really do.
Yeah, no problem. No, not a problem.
And something that you said just in closing here, as far as, it's a very, very personal thing, right? And you said that's why I felt okay with not sharing with anyone. I had no desire to do so. And I think that can carry over to people that harp on others that, same circumstance. They're on a trail. Say they're even out there with a badass like red 4K camera at their side, right? And guess what? They don't lift that camera up and they don't have the video, even though they were only 25 feet away from this 8-foot tall creature. And guess what? Maybe they didn't, it didn't, first of all, probably cross their mind, but maybe if it did, they didn't care to raise that because they just wanted to, as you said, soak it all in. Just, this is only going to last for maybe a few seconds. Let me soak this in. This is from me.
Yeah. I mean, I find, to me, that if you're that present of mind, I mean, it's an incredibly noble thought to have. Like, this is for me. I don't, especially in today's influencer popular culture, where everybody wants to be an influencer and every single solitary facet of everyone's life is documented and shared and retweeted. So to take something like that and hold it for yourself and not share it and not brag about it and not try to get a television special out of it is there is a nobility to that, I think. And honestly, there's a story, and I'm sure you've heard of it. You might have even covered it. Do you know the story about the Mount St. Helens Bigfoot? So, there was I'll make this short because I know I've been rambling on, but long story short, for anybody that doesn't know the story, after Mount St. Helens erupted in the 80s, the Army Corps of Engineers went in there. And as the story goes, they were there to not just burn up the animals that had died because of smoke inhalation, collect animal carcasses and burn them, but also to retrieve Bigfoot bodies that were up there because they knew that they were actually up there. And part of the story goes that they actually had a Bigfoot guide that was taking them around Mount St. Helens and pointing out where these injured and dead Sasquatch were. Now, that part of the story is not the important part. Whether you believe it or not is, again, it's irrelevant. Just like if you believe me or not, it's irrelevant. It's an entertaining story, but ultimately not important. What is important is the people that were there that were helping the Army Corps of Engineers or the Army, whoever it was, were told at the end of this, like, look, you saw what we saw. These things exist. They're up there. They're real. They just want to be left alone. So, if you feel the need to tell the story, wait 40 or 50 years and then you could tell it. And by then everybody involved in this process will be dead. But the point of this is that they're there and they just want to be left alone. They're not bothering anybody. And so my takeaway from the physical encounter of this story, my takeaway with the physical portion of this has always been just leave these things alone. Like they're there. It's not even a question if they're real or not. Yeah, these things are real. This exists. It's a real thing. And leave it alone. Don't go hunting it. Don't try to turn it into an Instagram superstar. Just leave it alone. It's very much a part of nature. It's not our job. It's not our responsibility to prove or disprove its existence. You don't need to do any of that. Just go about your life and just leave it alone. For me, it's like I look at it almost like a meditation. It's a thing that passes through your mind and you let it go. When it's over, you get up and you go about your day and you use that experience to propel yourself forward. But yeah, just in terms of it being a physical creature, it doesn't need to be hunted. It doesn't need its own Instagram page. Just leave it alone. Keep it as a story and folklore if you need to, but that's about it.
Well, if you do end up seeing that family of Bigfoot, like at the end of Harry and the Hendersons, you make sure you get in touch with me, okay? Because I want to hear about it.
God, I got to tell you, the fanboy in me would love that. Would absolutely love it. I mean, it's real easy for me to be, calm and collected and zen about this thing while I'm sitting in my office with a 27-inch monitor in front of me. But I got to tell you, if I were to run into a family or even another one of these things, I'd probably be a screaming Beatles fan.
Yeah.
I'd probably lose my mind. I can't say I would be zen about it. I mean, I'm dying to see a UFO or an alien. Like I'm just chomping at the bit for that to happen.
Well, no aliens in your bedroom though, because that's a whole nother can of worms and subject matter that maybe you don't want to be part of, right? None in the bedroom, because that means other things are going on that are not fun.
Well, I will say this though. Part of the God, this is not a course they teach in school or any kind of. This is kind of a lesson and you have to learn the hard way. One of the symptoms, one of the things that I had experienced when I first started dealing with this trauma was sleep paralysis. And I'd heard the term, but I didn't know really anything about it. But it's very real. Like it's very real. And the hallucinations that come with it are also very, very real. I didn't realize at the time, only later did I realize that the hallucinations that come with it are part of it. Like they come together. And not everybody, some people get the hallucinations and not the paralysis. Some people get the paralysis and not the hallucinations. But the hallucinations are very, very vivid. And it's always the same. It's like a dark spectral figure, either standing in the corner of your room or sitting at the foot of your bed. And like case after case after case of sleep paralysis report the exact same thing. I got to tell you, when it happened to me the first time, talk about terrified, doesn't even cover it. You ever wake up from a dream and you carry that sense that dream sense with you for a few moments after, you're still
Yes.
awake, but like, let's say you got mad at somebody in a dream and you wake up and you're still mad at them. I carried that sense of pure terror with me for the entire day. Like I was just on edge because it seemed that real. And it was only later on that I found out that was like, it was part of sleep paralysis. But I was like, oh my God, there's a person in this room and they're standing right there and they're staring at me. So yeah. Hopefully, I don't need any aliens in my bedroom. I'm good with that. In the sky, great. In my bedroom, no thanks.
Yes, way up in the sky is cool. Maybe close enough to see a little window. They can wave at you through the window. That's fine, but not in the bedroom. No floating through walls. No little weird marks on your skin. No thanks.
No, and certainly no probing.
No thanks. It's on the no list. Well, Dennis, thank you so much. I cannot even begin to tell you how much I appreciate you coming on and choosing me, of course, to tell your story too. What a truly unique encounter.
Thank you. I appreciate it. I really do. It feels good to finally talk about this and get this off my chest. And again, hopefully it reaches some